Hi there, I'm Peter Mayrick from Partners in Ministry. Thanks so much for joining us at this, our next in the webinar series to help ministers as they lead the Church of Jesus Christ. Today we're talking about one of those topics which is so important for us. In our aim to be disciplers and to be disciples, we want to be a church that is hospitable. We want to be a church that helps people move from casual to committed. We don't just want to be friendly churches, we want to make friends in the name of Jesus. And so this topic is so important for churches as they seek to make disciples of our Lord Jesus Christ. I am blessed today to be joined by Emily Dickinson and John Jeffries, who are both ministry partners here at Partners in Ministry, and their day job is to walk beside pastors as pastors lead churches. You see, we want to see churches flourish in the name of Jesus. We want to see churches that are vibrant, where people are welcome and people are growing in their love for Jesus and sharing the love of Jesus to others. And so this topic is so important, and both Emily and John's role is to walk beside pastors that they might do this. So let me introduce Emily Dickinson. Emily, as I said, works with Partners in Ministry. She walks beside pastors. She, prior to this, has been a pastor heading up hospitality at her church. And so this is a topic that is close to her. Welcome, Emily. I want to ask you, Emily, what do you love about this topic?
I love this topic for multiple reasons. One is that I had many conversations with people, both before I was in the role and during, where people just felt like they didn't connect. I saw people leave because they didn't connect, and that broke my heart. And then since then, I've actually learned just statistically across our nation that loneliness is massive. Christians and non-Christians, they're looking for belonging. And, I would love the church to be the place that people find that.
I'm looking forward to hearing more from Emily in a moment, but let me introduce John. John Jeffries is also a ministry partner, walking beside church leaders. John, in a previous life, headed up a really good organisation called Christian Blind Mission. And John has been working with many pastors and running workshops on this topic to help them. John, why do you love this topic? And then John's going to tell us more about the 7 keys to integrating newcomers.
It's dead easy to tell you why I feel passionate about this topic, and it's because it's been so impactful for my life and the life of my wife. Because 41 years ago, we moved from Sydney to Melbourne, and we went to a new church for the first time. And when we went to that church, we were welcomed in a very stunning way, a very great way, that has resulted in us quickly joining the church. And 41 years later, we are still members of that same church. We've brought our kids up at that church, and now our grandkids are at that church. So my own live experience of being welcomed well, I realise has had such a huge impact on me and my family, and it's also had impact on the local church as well. So I'm really pleased to talk about this topic because I think it's so important. One of the things I do when I talk to pastors in churches, I ask them to think about what is the welcome pathway that you want a new visitor to go on if you're going to take them from a first-time visit to your church to down the track finally becoming a member of your church. What does that journey look like? What are the key points in that journey? And sometimes we draw it up like a flowchart, working out what the different segments and points are of a welcome journey for a new person that comes to your church. I find often pastors and churches often underestimate the number of visitors they have each year to a church. When I do this as a workshop, I usually ask the people to name for me, when do they think the welcome journey starts for a newcomer to your church? And usually the hands will go up, and most people will say something like, they think the welcome journey starts when you arrive in the car park. Or they'll say, we think the welcome journey starts when they first enter the auditorium of the church. And what we gently point out to them is those things are important on the journey, but for 90% of your first-time visitors to a church, they will have already been to your website. And usually people go, aha, I hadn't thought of it. You start to see the logic of it, but you need to work out that 90% of your first-time visitors have been to your website. And when I do this as a seminar, I see some people sneaking a look on their phone to pull up their church's website because they're a bit worried about what's on it.
And they're asking the question, who is our website for? Is it for the insider? Is it for the outsider?
That's exactly right. And one of the recommendations I make to people is your first landing page on the website should have very clearly what the time and place of your worship service is. That's the key information a lot of your visitors look for. We also know that statistically, if you look at the usage of your website, the most commonly visited page on your website will be something called Meet the Team or About the Pastor. That's what people are most interested in. They're not so interested in your curious approach to theology. They're interested in learning about the people that they're likely to meet when they come and visit your church. And I really encourage churches to put details about their pastoral team and their various employees and key volunteers in an interesting manner. So rather than describing the pastor's degrees in theology, people are more likely to want to understand, does he support Collingwood or Carlton? Is he a tea or coffee person? What's his family like or her family like? The personal stuff is what people want to see because they're imagining in their brain, if I visit this church, what's it going to feel like? Who will I meet? So the warmer you can make those pages, the better.
First thing you've said is that there's a clear welcome pathway. We know what the pathway is. The second thing you said is the website. And you had to go with Collingwood. Like it could have been the Swans, mate. That would have been more welcoming, I would have thought. But there we go. Keep going.
That's exactly right. And it leads you to think about what are the steps that are happening along the whole process. So when we look at after the website and coming into the door of your church for the first time, what's that experience like? And what we know that in Australia, roughly 60% of your first-time visitors will be churched people. They're Christian people who are used to being part of a church. So they get the idea what happens in a church. They understand that there'll be a person up front the front. They understand there'll be singing, there'll be prayers. They're at home in that environment. For 40% of your first-time visitors, they have not been to a church before or maybe only for a funeral or something like that. And they are feeling very lost. They're feeling very apprehensive. They're a little bit worried. They're not sure what's going to happen. And those people are likely to want to sit in the back row or in a corner of your church. So that's just because they're feeling very tentative about coming in. So it's really good to think through what's the experience like for a well-churched person versus someone who's coming into your church for the first time. I often encourage people to think about the greeter or the welcomer as more like an usher who will put people at ease, show them a seat, maybe tell them a little bit about the church, who the pastor is, how long it goes for, etc. Then I encourage people to think about what happens when the service ends, because there's been a whole lot of research done that identifies the time at which a first-time visitor decides whether your church is friendly or not is what happens in the 10 minutes after the service. They don't make that decision in the car park. They don't make that decision in the first entrance to your church. They really make that decision in what happens in the 10 minutes after the church ends.
And John, does it matter if the person that talks to them after the service is a pastor or somebody sitting next to them or somebody with a tag on? Like, does it matter? Does it make a difference?
Great question.
I think it should be any of those people, and it should be all of those people. We also ask churches, whose job do you think it is to make the experience to be friendly? And everyone automatically goes, well, it's all our job to do that.
Fantastic.
But what I noticed when I first came across this research 5 or 10 years ago, what I noticed in my church is that we have a welcome team, and they did a good job, and they all knocked off after the first song was sung. So they did the really good stuff at the beginning. Once the first song was sung, they went in and sat down, and no one was paying any attention to what happens in the 10 minutes after the service ends. And for most churches, this is not too bad. Most churches do have friendly, open, extroverted people who will be aware that there's new people present. And often, as soon as the service ends, they will make a bit of a beeline to them. But it doesn't always happen. I think we've all had the experience of what it's like to be lonely in a crowd. Mm-hmm. And if when the service ends, the normal people from the church sitting, engaging in conversation with each other and ignore the newcomer, wow, you can feel like a shake on a rock. You can feel really alone. We talk in terms, we use the phrase pew missionaries. Pew missionaries are people, often the warm, open people of a congregation who are aware who the new people are and who will make a quick trip to greet them as soon as the service ends. And therefore, we want to encourage churches to think about those pew missionary people as an important part of the welcome process. It's really important to think through the experience of a person the 10 minutes after service ends.
There's a piece that I'm reminded of when I run a workshop on this area. When we talk about those 10 minutes, I tend to talk about the 2 minutes directly after the close and model to people and say, how lonely is this uncomfortable time? The truth is, I only need about 3% of the room to decide to be pew missionaries, and suddenly this church becomes a welcoming church. Because it only takes one person to come and talk to the person at the end of the service, and suddenly that person feels like they've been welcomed well. It's such a good point. Thank you, mate.
So the first time I heard that, I was actually surprised by it, because even in my role and in other churches that I worked with when I was in my role, there was very much a front load mentality. First impressions are important. Get in there and, welcome them at the door and make sure they find a seat. And then it was that idea of, and then we can just leave them. And then there's a gap. I feel like there's and we have the welcome table afterwards where we would love to get to know you more. We'll get you a coffee or whatever. But there's not that gap, I think, is very evident in probably most church strategies around how to do hospitable, welcoming and make people feel loved.
And John made that comment about the pathway, but the pathway is just a pathway to direct personhood. It's got to be personal, right?
Totally.
Your comment about ministry team, employees versus non-employees, I think is important. When I first started 12 years ago doing this sort of stuff, the data in the NCLS would say that there are about 3% of people were visitors in the average church. Now, if you think about a church of 100, that would be 100 to 150 people over 50 weeks in the year. But I met about 6 to 10 pastors who said when they first heard that data, they thought it was wrong because they'd never seen that number of visitors. But since they were presented the data, they had watched the back door and they said to me, Peter, I'm ashamed. We've had visitors here, but I never saw them. And so I think that says to me, we need to recognise that paid staff are really busy. And they are probably too busy to be the key welcomers. And after the service, they've got things they need to do. They've got people they need to follow up with and things like that. So I think lay people, average Joes, need to get better at welcoming. And that's the great thing about a welcoming team. They're not paid people. They are people for whose job it is and whose awareness is to welcome the visitor.
Yeah, I did a session for a larger church in Melbourne a little while ago, and I was working with their welcome team, and we were talking about this, and they were very open and honest. And what they said was, when we think about it, what we do as soon as the service ends, we go and catch up with each other. Often there's some business to interact with. And what they said was they're going to make a commitment as a church from that point onwards that they would not speak to each other until they could see every visitor in the room was engaged in meaningful conversation.
Great.
Wow.
And I thought that's very powerful. you're really getting at as to the importance of it. There's another thing that I find is a little counterintuitive here, and that's some research that's been done on what are the most unhelpful things we can do with new people first-time visit. And what the research shows is one of the most unhelpful things you can do is to have a time in your service where visitors have to stand up and greet the people around them. And it's interesting.
Why is that?
It's fascinating. When I tell seminars or groups this question, I tell them that fact that first-time visitors are very reluctant to have to stand up, identify themselves, and do something interactive. I immediately divide the room. And what I see is all the extroverts in the room saying, what's this black magic this bloke's talking about? And as they're doing that, all the introverts in the room are sitting there with their arms folded going, I really, really hate that.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is a lot of services are led by the extroverts, and they assume that just because they like to stand up and identify themselves, that everyone's like that. So the message there is you have to be very cautious about anything you're doing during the service that causes the visitors to have the spotlight thrown upon them. Some are okay with it. Some are really, really uncomfortable with that.
Clear welcome pathway. Number 2, you said, was an excellent website. Number 3 was to train pew missionaries. Where do you take us to next? Where's 4?
Let's look at what you do after the experience on a Sunday. How do you follow up your first-time visitors?
Okay.
And here we know from various research, there's a connection between the amount of time you wait to catch up with a first-time visitor and the likelihood of them returning.
So you shouldn't leave it to
best
next
practice is to follow up a first-time visitor within 36 hours of them attending your service.
Wow, that takes organisation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It really means you need to think this through. And again, research has shown that the likelihood of them returning is impacted by who follows them up. And a rather counterintuitive thing here is they're much likely to return to your church if it's an unpaid person who follows them up. So this is not to say your paid staff, your pastors, etc., are no good at this. What this is speaking to is the power of volunteers. If a volunteer follows a first-time visitor up, the message they're really giving the first-time visitor is, I love my church so much, I'm prepared to go out of my way to encourage you to come and be part of our church. That's a very powerful message. So it's not saying the pastor's not good at this. It is saying that it's a lot more powerful if it's an unpaid person who follows up first-time visitors. What is the next step for a first-time visitor? Is the experience going to be they come back next week, and because we've done a really good job with our welcome team the first week, they come back the next week and there's no one available to talk to them? We need to think through what's the pathway you want them to take. The pathway you want to take a Christian person who's maybe moved cities and is wanting to join your church is very different to someone who's coming for the first time, non-Christian, unfamiliar with the way churches operate. Your next step with them is going to be often very different. You might want to point a non-Christian to a program your church might be running from time to time on Alpha or Christianity Explained or something. Whereas with a well-churched person who's really looking at, is this the right church for me to make my home, you might go straight to talking about what our small groups are like or how they can get involved more intimately with the life of the congregation.
It's interesting, John. So what you're suggesting quite clearly is whilst most people are looking for belonging, the next desire is different for different people. I'm looking for a church I could join. I'm looking for a church that has X, Y, Z versus I came to this church because I'm interested in Christianity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One thing, again, some researchers looked at is for a first-time visitor, if they start repeat visiting your church, if they've been coming along with a friend, say Emily's invited me, the first time I go, I will be going to Emily's church. And when I come back the second time, I will be going to Emily's church. And at some point down the track, I'll change my language and I'll start to say, I am going to my church.
Oh, wow.
And the point where that spins is to do with multiplicity of relationship. So whilst ever the only person I know at the church is Emily, I'm going to be always describing it as I go to Emily's church. When I suddenly have a relationship with 2, 3, 4 more people at the church, that's when I start using the phrase my church. And that's when you get to this sense of belonging. Once people are talking about my church, they're saying, I feel like I belong there. So it's really important to think through multiplicity of relationship, how you can engage first-time visitors with different members of your congregation, because that's just going to be helpful in them feeling it's a friendly church where they're warm and included.
Emily, in your situation, did you find a way to do that, to help people move from Emily's church to my church and building those relationships?
Yeah, there was a few ways. So there definitely is the program, right? So come to Alpha or go to your small group or whatever. There is the program. What I found really effective was when somebody naturally understood the power of what we're talking about, and they would get their number. They would we had a few people who on purpose, there was a group of them, and they would say, this week is my turn to have lunch at my house. They knew they had X amount of seats that they could accommodate people, and they would only invite, if there was 10, they would say, I have 5 people I'm going to on purpose invite, and I have 5 spaces to find visitors on a Sunday, and I'm going to invite them for lunch. And those people, there was a round robin. Wow. And every week they'd change houses so that it wasn't on anybody's shoulders, and they would invite people over. And I cannot tell you how much our church grew just from those people getting the fact that, hey, you know what, it's not just about being friendly, it's about being friends. And they would actually invite them into their life. They became friends. They started small groups, and exponentially we grew. And
now we're discipling, which is
exactly.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
John, the comment about next steps, when I run a workshop on this topic, I quite often get people to think about the possible destinations. Someone who's not a Christian or not churched, where would we like them to end up? As you said, someone who's churched, where would we like them to end up? Could be a growth group, Bible study, etc. Could be a membership course. But what I found was when people have a pathway, the welcomer now knows what to say next. And they typically know to ask the question, are you a regular at church? Do you come to church much? And once they get the answer, they start persuading the person about the next step. And so this idea of having clarity of pathway, I think, is just so important and profound. The other thing I've learned is that most people who haven't been to church for years will be pleasantly surprised with your church service, with your worst church service. And the reason why is people who haven't been at church for years remember a boring thing. They used to count bricks and things like that because they were too young to listen to the sermon or listen to the talk or join the singing. They've grown up in the last decade and they come along to church, and the biggest shift is them. They can now sit and listen, and so they're pleasantly surprised with what they're seeing. John, do you have something to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what it causes you to think about too, Peter, is the power of your church members inviting their friends and relatives.
Right, yes.
And if we believe the media, it sounds like no one's really interested in church these days. That's not supported by the facts. Our friends at the National Church Life Survey have talked about this a lot. That if a non-church attender, particularly someone who used to attend, a lapsed attender, if they're invited by a friend or a relative they respect, they are very likely to say yes to an invitation to come. Very likely. It's not what people sometimes expect. So there's power in your congregation being encouraged to invite their friends and relatives. And they are likely to accept an invitation.
Now, John, you've given us then, from your list that you gave me beforehand, 6 out of the 7, which are a clear welcome pathway, an excellent website, trained pew missionaries, speedy follow-up, clear next steps, and then a culture of inviting. What's the 7th?
This is really interesting, I think, and it goes to what I was saying about inviting new people along. It's the collective confidence in your church in knowing that if they did invite a friend or relative, that the experience they're going to have with your church isn't going to be strange or confronting or weird or wacky. When the congregation feels like, I love my church and I really want others to come and experience that, that's very powerful for the likelihood of their inviting. From the research, what we know is that people are very likely to accept an invitation from a friend or relative, which means that they're likely to attend a normal worship service at your church. So you don't need to be thinking about, well, let's put a special emphasis on Christmas and Easter. We'll do the C&E thing, Christmas and Easter, or we'll have a invite your friends Sunday or something like that. Do those by all means, absolutely. But the point is, the most common time a visitor's attending your church is for a normal worship service. So what I say to groups when I'm doing some workshops, I say to them, if your welcome team has an A game, they need to play the A game every week. Mm-hmm. And bizarrely, again from research, the month of the year that you're most likely to receive visitors is January. And most worship teams have a holiday in January. We think it's to do with people moving interstate with jobs or whatever at the end of the year. But the month of the year most likely to have visitors is January. So you need to think about how you're going to be welcomed there. You also need to be thinking about this whole idea of collective confidence, where all of the people feel really comfortable with what's happening at the church. And they're saying, the thing I would like most is to share this experience with my friends and relatives. I'm confident that if they come to my church, they're likely to have an encounter with Jesus. They're likely to see what could happen with their life if they make a commitment to follow Jesus and to be part of a church. What wonderful outcomes could come as part of that.
Emily, you were suggesting the effective ministry paper you read in the last week. We'll put that in the show notes too. Is there anything you wanted to share about that?
There was a few really, it's gold. The whole thing is gold. So please, if you can, read it, if this is an area you want to grow in. One of the things I noticed when I read it was that this is not natural. And when I read that, I thought, it's not. I think we naturally might think, when people walk through the door and then when people leave, that's the experience. And, it's not natural to consider all the little factors of after the service. And I think naturally humans we're quite selfish. So it's not always natural to think about all of these. So to look at your flow chart, to look at the culture of your inviting, to look at the culture of hospitality in your church, and then to think about, the discipleship of, do we include this idea of being friends, not just being friendly, in our discipleship? Because I think it totally is connected.
How do you think we do that?
It's a great question. I do think sometimes ships are big and it's hard to turn them sometimes. So it is I think there's multiple ways. There's very intentional, we're going to do some training. We at Partners in Ministry would love to come in and help you with that if that would be something that you'd want. To come in and really, explain this stuff. To get a culture, really you have to shift, give them some language, educate them. They may not even have thought about it. We had somebody once come to our church as almost like a secret shopper. So somebody that didn't normally come to church to just share with the team, hey, this was my experience as somebody who's never been to your church before and somebody that doesn't come to church. That to me was eye-opening to realize I don't know what it feels like to be new. I don't know what it feels like to be, welcomed. So I think that's a huge part of it actually is, getting feedback from somebody that does come, whether that's somebody you arrange as a secret shopper, so to speak, or, just asking somebody that's come new for the first time, how's it been for you today? The other thing is, just a constant discipleship, preaching, hospitality, Bible studies, being just our growth and our faith, really.
It's interesting. You started with awareness there. I'm reminded of two things. The first was that I remember a pastor who wanted to build a welcoming community. He took his welcoming team to the TAB and said, "Here's $10, go in there and place a bet." And then when they debriefed, he said, "This is how most unchurched people feel when they walk into your church."
That's awesome.
And I just thought it was so clever.
That's fantastic.
Hospitality is unnatural, isn't it? It's an act of the heart. This is supernatural love. This is not natural. And it's also supernatural to want to love someone and be hospitable to someone who's not like me. So this is an act of discipleship.
It is, because in churches, we bump into people all the time I wouldn't naturally be friends with, And when I meet people on Sunday, it's really thinking outside of who I am to serve them, to love them, to figure out what they are interested in so I can connect them with people. Like it is a skill, really, that we don't always naturally have.
Yeah, I think part of it too is, and really, like you said with the TAB example, start to think like a newcomer. I did a seminar for a rather large church in Melbourne, and they had a big auditorium, and on the side at the back was like a kitchen with an opening into the kitchen where they served tea and coffee through. And right next to that, right above it, they had this huge sign with an arrow, and it said "Newcomers here," or the huge arrow pointing down. And what they expected was after the service for newcomers to go and stand under that arrow. And I said to them, "Who here wants to go and stand under the arrow?" And they all said, "We'll take the sign down straight away." You're not thinking like a newcomer, you're thinking like what works for us. But no newcomer wants to come and stand under the arrow. Another church I have some involvement with, they've taken it to a really next step of working on hospitality. When you arrive as a newcomer to this church, they say to you, "Emily, what's your coffee order?" And you say something like skinny decaf latte. And as soon as the service ends, you are presented with a skinny decaf latte.
Wow.
Do you think you're going to stick around? Absolutely.
I like
So
coffee.
churches are really looking at innovative ways of using hospitality to be more welcoming so that first-time visitors will feel comfortable in joining a church.
I want to make sure to point out as well, it's a both and. So it's not just the systems we have in place as the staff and the getting the coffees and the super important, but if you have that and your culture is not welcoming and somebody leaves and says the only people that talk to me were the people that were made to talk to me, they will notice, So it's a both and. Whereas if you have beautiful people and no system to kind of get them connected or pathway to put them through, also they're probably going to think, well, they were lovely, but I don't know what to do next.
Yeah, thank you. I think this workshop is a great workshop because it's quite simple and straightforward, and you can make a profound change quite quickly. You and I both know the easy part are the first 3 weeks. Being hospitable, the third, the fourth, the fifth visit is a supernatural behaviour. It really is quite a challenge. And Emily, you remind me again and again, this is an act of discipleship. This is super power love. This is supernatural. I want to ask you both, so if you were working with a church and you wanted to know whether it was a welcoming church, what would you measure or what would you see? What does good look like? You've mentioned the 7 things, but how would I know if I looked at information, this church is a welcoming church? Or let me ask a different question. If I was to measure whether my church is a welcoming church, what would I measure?
Really what I listen for is stories. Mm-hmm. So I want to hear, yes, stats are important and, we can look at numbers, but really I want to know the stories of where have people come for the first time and, either Christian or not Christian, and then what's the impact that had on them? What's the reason they came? Did they stay? You know, how have they been integrated into the church? I want to hear the story of the impact of that.
Yeah, and of course, stories build culture. You talked about a culture of collective confidence. You sharing the stories in a de-identified manner builds the culture, right?
I think stories are incredibly helpful. I think too, having the ability to just confront reality and understanding where your church really is in this process. So actually have a look at your church with how many people are coming and how many of those are newcomers that have joined in the last 1 or 2 years. It's going to give you some idea what's happening within your church. If you have an understanding of what percentage of people, newcomers, are participating in the life of your church. I think this is particularly good too with young adults, young people, to have some understanding of, does your church retain the young people to your church? Or is it when they get to uni years, they wander off? The most likely point that a person will leave a church is at the age of 20. So thinking through what your strategy is to retain the young people who is part of your church. So being game to measure things, I think, is very healthy. Having an understanding of what's going on with the movements within your congregation. Having an understanding on too, what's the past been like? Is your church growing, or is it static, or is it declining? And really having the courage to confront this reality, to inform what you might want to tweak or do better, or where you want to place more emphasis in, that's going to make your young people more likely to stay, going to take your first-time visitors through to a person who becomes a full member of your church, whatever that means in your context, and understanding what the attendance pattern has been like for your church in the past. I think they're important measures for you to have a reading on, to make some judgments as you go ahead.
I work with churches and we look at retained visitors as a stat. And what I've learnt to recognise is that different churches in different places will have different percentages of retained visitors because of the place that they are. Like, is 25% retained visitors a good stat? Well, it could be a great stat, or it could be better. And we just need to get better at asking, well, is that good? Thank you, Lord. 25% is better than zero. And what could we do? Could we do anything to turn it into 40? It's important to use statistics well, rather than to puff our ego or to beat us over the head. We want to learn from them.
I looked at my own church, and when I found out the statistic of how many newcomers are normally in a church of 100 people, I first said to myself, oh, that might be true for other churches, but I don't think it's true of my church. And then over the next month, I sat and counted, and I was wrong. I was surprised that we have more visitors than we expect. And I'm usually a person fairly good with figures. I was wrong. I think it is important that you use your numbers to help you make judgments of which of the areas you want to tweak in the life of your church, which of the areas you want to put more effort into in the life of the church, because we're wanting to change people's lives. We're wanting people to have a meaningful encounter with Jesus. So retaining our young people, retaining our visitors is really important to what the growth of the church is going to be like in the years ahead.
I said there were two things Emily reminded me of. The second thing was a letter I read from a friend of mine. The letter was written to him by two young ladies who were looking for a church, both churched women, and they went to 7 churches here in Sydney. And 2 of the churches they went to, they had people talk to them. The other 5, people just didn't talk to them. It just reminds me that we typically or naturally are friendly to our friends. We're not friendly to those people that are outside of us. So there's lots of work in this space. And yet it's not so hard to make a small change.
Yeah, and even speaking to that, you know, when people look at a website, I'm assuming that's how most people find that a church exists. If that website's super friendly, but their experience of the church isn't very friendly, there's a major discord and mismatch, you know. and people realize like, oh, they've done marketing. They haven't actually, lived up to what they say.
A clear welcome pathway, an excellent website, trained pew missionaries, speedy follow-up, clear next steps, a culture of inviting, and a culture of collective confidence. Both of you, thank you so much. We will put those 7 points into the show notes. We'll also put that link that Emily mentioned so that you can access that effective ministry piece. Please feel free to read it. As Emily said earlier, we exist to support pastors, to support church leaders. And so we would love to help you, to help your people to be more welcoming, and to help you as they implement their welcoming pathway. Please feel free to follow us up. You can contact us through our email address, info@partnersinministry.com, or through our website, which is www.partnersinministry.com. Emily and John, last words from you. What would you like to say?
This is hugely important, both inside and outside the church, and work on it. I have a quote actually from that paper that you've been talking about. It says, next Sunday, the Spirit of God will prompt hundreds of thousands of people and millions around the world, in our country and millions around the world, to visit a church for the first time. Each visitor is God's gift to you. First-time guests are extraordinary gifts full of unparalleled potential. As God brings them through our doors, our responsibility is to show our gratitude and commitment by doing our part to turn those new faces into new, fully developing disciples.
Wow, thank you.
I think that's fantastic, Emily, because it speaks to me of my own personal experience. Because my wife and I were welcomed well, 41 years later, we're still loving our local church and are active in our local church. And it's been a huge blessing in our life because we were welcomed well.
John and Emily, thank you so much for your wisdom. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to pass this on to others if you think this would be helpful. And please look us up if we can help you in any way. May God bless you. May God bless your ministry richly. And may Jesus be honored. God bless.